The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed low above her head, a rhythm too steady, too sterile to match the thunder in her chest. Dr. Amara Fields leaned against the cool metal shelving in the back corner of the ER's central supply room, her breath shallow, her spine taut as a bowstring. The faint scent of antiseptic and plastic packaging clung to the air, usually comforting, today suffocating. Her fingers still held the IV kit she'd come to retrieve. She hadn't expected anyone else to be here. No one ever was during the night shift, especially this deep in the hospital's labyrinth. But Douglas Rayner had a way of appearing where he wasn't supposed to, like a shadow that moved of its own volition. And tonight that shadow had followed her in. "I asked you not to ignore me," he murmured behind her, the door clicking shut with a deliberate finality that stole every ounce of oxygen from the room. She turned slowly, her knuckles white against the plastic-wrapped tubing. There he stood, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit tie, loosened just enough to feign casualness. But there was nothing casual in his expression. His eyes, an icy pale blue, gleamed with something darker than interest. Possession. Control. "Mr. Rayner," she said, her voice clipped, her posture rigid with professionalism. "This area is restricted. You need to leave." He smiled, an expression more calculated than warm. "Oh, come now, Dr. Fields. After everything we've shared, don't you think Douglas is more appropriate?" Amara's stomach turned. She forced her feet to stay planted. "We haven't shared anything. That night was not what you believe it was." A pause, then a laugh, a low condescending sound. "You really should be careful with your words," he said, stepping closer. "People might start thinking you're ungrateful." She instinctively stepped back, her spine hitting the steel shelf behind her. Medical boxes rattled above her head. "You cornered me," she said, her voice sharper, now trembling with the fury of someone who'd tried too long to stay silent. "You touched me without consent. I never agreed to any of it. That's not sharing. That's—" His hand moved fast, not to strike her, but to trap her. One palm flat on the metal beside her head, the other resting too close above her wrist fingers, ghosting over her skin like ice. "Careful," he whispered, close enough for her to smell the cloying, expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the decay underneath. "You're not just a doctor, you're a black woman from the wrong side of Durham. Who do you think the board will believe, me or you?" Her entire body locked in place. It wasn't just fear. It was the realization that he'd already calculated every angle, every threat, every trap. He knew. He knew she was pregnant. She hadn't told anyone, not yet. But his words, the implication that he had eyes on her inside and outside the hospital. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, still flat but different now. 14 weeks. Too early to show, too late to pretend it was a mistake that might go away. "You won't get away with this," she said, voice quiet but unflinching. He smiled again, his eyes narrowing with amusement. "I already have." And then as suddenly as he'd cornered her, he stepped back, adjusted his jacket, straightened his cuffs, as if he hadn't just threatened to upend her entire life with a whisper. "Do try to be more cooperative, Dr. Fields," he said, already turning toward the door. "After all, we're going to be seeing a lot more of each other." When the door clicked shut behind him, Amara collapsed to the floor, her scrubs rustling against the tile, her pulse racing like it was trying to outrun her bones. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She pressed her forehead to her knees and whispered, "Not this time. You won't destroy me this time." The silence that followed was not empty, it was loaded with decision. She would not be broken, not again. That night as she resumed her shift, no one could tell her world had just cracked open. She performed triage, she delivered bad news, she reset a child's dislocated arm, all while her secret grew beneath her skin and a predator smiled in the hallways. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet ember flickered, not of revenge, not yet, of survival, of something stronger than fear, of the belief, no, the certainty that someone someday would see her, hear her, and believe her. And when that day came, her story would no longer begin with violence. It would begin with love. Sometimes stories like this aren't just stories. They're reflections of pain, resilience, and the power of choosing hope again. If this story stirred something in you, if you believe in stories where justice and love prevail, leave a comment, even a simple heart. Like follow and stay with us for the journey. The story is just beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the high windows of St. Clair Memorial Hospital, brushing the tiled floors with honeyed gold and softening the sterile edges of the emergency ward. But for Dr. Amara Fields, the light only made the shadows sharper. She stood in the staff locker room, arms crossed beneath the gray cotton of her scrubs, staring into the mirror. Her reflection didn't speak, but it accused her anyway of hiding, of enduring, of surviving without screaming. 14 weeks. She touched her abdomen gently, the motion almost reverent, almost fearful. There was no bump yet, not really. A subtle fullness, a different way her waistband pressed at the end of long shifts. But she could feel the change. In her body, in her soul, in the way she navigated space like a hunted creature, in the way she flinched at every unexpected footstep behind her. And most of all, in the weight of the secret growing inside her. She had researched every possibility, quietly, desperately. Termination, relocation, adoption. But no matter how she turned the options over in her mind, they all collapsed under the same truth: she was already connected. The baby had not asked to exist, had not chosen the circumstances, but neither had she. And yet, this fragile life nestled inside her felt separate from the man who had forced it into being. A thing innocent and undeserving of shame. A tiny heartbeat fluttering like a protest in the dark. That morning, she tied her hair back tighter than usual, pinned her badge exactly parallel to her name tag, and walked out onto the ER floor with the poise of someone who had something to prove. To everyone. To no one. To herself. The hospital was her battlefield and her sanctuary. Amid the chaos of alarms, stretchers, and trauma charts, Amara found clarity. Here pain had protocols. Bleeding had sutures. Crises could be stabilized with confidence and skill. She was good at her job. Brilliant, in fact. And for the first time since December, she clung to that like armor. Dr. Fields came the voice of Nurse Allen from triage. Motorcycle collision incoming 20s, male head trauma, likely internal bleeding. Bay 2, let's prep. Page neurosurgery just in case. She moved fast enough to escape her own thoughts. Fast enough to quiet the memory of a hand pinning her to cold metal. Fast enough to forget for a moment that her future had been reshaped without her permission. But grief lingered in quiet corners. Even as she worked, it whispered to her. The patient was young, barely more than a boy. His eyes, frantic and searching through blood, reminded her that life was fragile, that it could be stolen, or gifted, or in her case, forced. She saved him. She always did. But afterward, as she scrubbed her hands clean beneath the motion-activated sink, she caught sight of her wrist in the mirror. Faint crescent marks remained from where Douglas's fingernails had pressed down weeks ago. They had faded but not disappeared. Like her smile. Later that evening, Amara stood on the hospital's rooftop patio, a space rarely used except by nurses on their breaks. The chill in the air kissed her skin like truth. Below her, the city glowed in flickers, streetlights, window lamps, late-night gas stations. She inhaled deeply. What would happen if she told someone? The question felt dangerous, even asking it silently. She imagined going to HR, sitting across from one of those beige-suited professionals with sympathetic eyes but cautious words. She imagined their glances, their suggestions to handle things internally, their fear of angering a man like Douglas Rayner, who sat on more than one hospital board and had cut a ribbon at last year's pediatric wing opening. And worse, she imagined not being believed at all. She had no proof, only a memory she couldn't unsee: a child growing in her womb, and the aching silence of a woman betrayed by the system she had served her entire life. She rested a hand on her stomach again, feeling the smallest stirrings. Not physical, not yet, but emotional. An awareness. A presence. I don't know how to do this, she whispered more to herself than the night, but I won't let him own us. The stars blinked overhead, uncaring but present. Amara didn't cry. She hadn't allowed herself that since December, but her jaw softened. Her breath slowed, and the shadows that had followed her all day seemed for one moment to draw back just a little. 2 floors below in the hospital cafe, now quiet for the night, a man sat alone with a coffee untouched. Grant Whitmore. His shoulder still ached from the accident, but the bruises were healing. The stitches over his left eyebrow had left a faint scar, one that curved like an unfinished sentence. He wasn't sure why he kept coming back here. He told himself it was about the environment he liked to observe, to sketch new design ideas for trauma-ready medical spaces. But that wasn't entirely true. It was her, Dr. Amara Fields, the first woman in years who had looked at him and seen something beyond a name or a bank account. The first woman who had touched his chest, literally in his case, and steadied his breath. But there had also been something else, a flicker in her eyes, a tremble beneath her surface, a wound she hadn't spoken of. He recognized it because he carried one too. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he would speak to her again, not as a patient, but as a man who had once built cathedrals of glass and steel and now inexplicably wanted to help rebuild a life. Even if she never knew how much he already cared, even if she never let him in, because some people deserve to be seen. And he had seen her clearly, pain and all, and he wasn't looking away. It began with a siren, not the wail of warning it had once been, not a cry that tore through her nerves with urgency, but something else, a summoning, a sound that would unknowingly pull 2 souls into the same orbit. Dr. Amara Fields stood at the nurse's station when the call came through scaffolding collapse at a private construction site in West Asheville. 1 casualty confirmed, possibly more. ETA, 3 minutes. She glanced at the monitor. Bay 4 was open. Prep trauma 4, she instructed calmly, already pulling on gloves. Chest trauma protocol. I want vitals monitored every 2 minutes and imaging cued the moment he's stable. The paramedics burst in moments later, a gurney wheeled between them with military efficiency. The patient was semi-conscious, shirt-shredded chest, rising with laborious, uneven breaths. Blood slicked the left side of his face where a deep gash split his forehead and his right shoulder had clearly dislocated. Amara stepped in before the wheels stopped rolling. Vitals. BP 90-60 climbing. Tachycardic but responsive. Head wound cleaned and compressed. Suspected rib fractures, no punctures on field exam. Good work, Amara murmured, then turned to her team. On my count, 1-2 lift. They moved him onto the trauma bed with practiced grace. As the nurses adjusted monitors and began cleaning wounds, Amara leaned in, shining a penlight into his eyes. His left eye blinked sluggishly. The right opened, and then held, dark green flecked with gold and impossibly present despite the pain. He didn't speak right away, but he didn't look away either. Do you know where you are? She asked gently. His voice was hoarse but clear. Hospital, I hope. You hope correctly, Amara replied, lips lifting despite herself. You've taken quite a hit, mister. Grant, he rasped. Grant Whitmore. The name stirred something faint in her memory, but it was gone before she could grasp it. The familiarity wasn't important now. He was her patient, and he was bleeding. She moved efficiently, examining his chest, tracing gentle fingers over fractured ribs, watching his face for signs of stress. His muscles twitched beneath her touch, but he didn't flinch. He watched her with a kind of quiet intensity that unsettled her, not because it was invasive, but because it was honest. Too honest. You're safe now, she said more to herself than to him. He blinked slowly. Doesn't feel like it. No. Her tone stayed clinical, but she glanced up, her eyes meeting his again. I feel like I've been hit by a building, he said. And then, found. The word landed inside her like a whisper she wasn't ready to hear. She cleared her throat. Let's fix you first. Philosophy can wait. He smiled, though it came with a wince. Later, with his head wound stitched and shoulder reset, Grant lay propped slightly in the hospital bed, drowsy but lucid. The worst was over. The scans were clear. The damage would heal. Amara returned to check on him just before her shift ended, clipboard in hand. The sun had dipped low over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting the room in amber light through the high windows. You'll be sore for a while, she said, reviewing his vitals. But nothing's broken beyond repair. Good news, he replied, voice smoother now. I'll try not to collapse under anything else for a while. She allowed herself a small smile. You'd do well to avoid heavy falling objects. But I'll admit your timing was exceptional. Why, you caught us during the lull between chaos. Usually you'd be waiting 2 hours for a curtain and a chart. Well, I suppose I'm lucky, he said softly. He didn't mean the bed. Amara tapped the chart and turned to leave. She wasn't sure what unnerved her more, the softness in his voice, or the fact that despite everything she wanted to hear more of it. Dr. Fields. She paused at the door. I know I've taken a few knocks to the head today, he said, but I meant what I said earlier. I do feel like I've been found. Her breath caught. Most people don't see past the blood, he continued. You did, even when you're hurting yourself. Her spine stiffened, though her hand trembled faintly on the doorknob. You don't know anything about me, she said, her voice too calm to be steady. I don't need to, Grant replied. I just know pain when I see it. For one moment the room felt smaller, as if the air between them had thickened with something unnamed. Not romance. Not yet. But recognition, like two bruised chords resonating on the same frequency. She left without replying. That night in her apartment nestled just beyond the French Broad River, Amara sat alone in the quiet. She didn't turn on music. She didn't open her laptop. She simply pressed her palm to her stomach and closed her eyes. Something had shifted today. It wasn't just Grant's words, or the way he'd looked at her without pity, without expectation, only clarity. It was the fact that for the first time in months, she hadn't felt like a shattered object pretending to be whole. She had felt seen, and even if nothing more came of it, that was something worth remembering. She didn't believe in fate, not since December, but she believed in timing. And maybe the universe had offered her a flicker of light in a stranger's eyes. A stranger bleeding. A stranger who had noticed the wound she kept hidden and hadn't looked away. The world outside the hospital was soft with fog, a quiet gray curtain drawn over the city of Asheville. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but its memory lingered on the pavement, slick, glistening, and full of secrets. Grant Whitmore stood beneath the overhang outside St. Clair Memorial's west entrance, hands tucked into the pockets of a tailored charcoal coat. His shoulder still ached from the scaffolding fall. The scar on his forehead, though neatly stitched, tugged at his skin when he raised an eyebrow. He was supposed to be recovering, resting, but here he was lingering, watching, not in the way a man watches a woman out of idle attraction. No, there was nothing idle about the way Grant observed the world. Architects rarely saw things the way others did. They didn't look at walls, they looked through them to structure, to tension points, to weight distribution, and what might collapse under pressure. And Dr. Amara Fields, she was carrying the weight of something that didn't belong to her. He'd seen it that first night, not just in the way her hands moved with flawless precision, but in the way her shoulders stiffened when someone entered the room behind her. In the glance she cast over her shoulder, not with curiosity, but calculation. Fear sheathed in grace. He recognized it, not just because he was intuitive, but because he had once lived with a sister who had worn the same look. After her divorce, after the bruises, after the silence that swallowed her for 2 years, and now he saw it again. Amara walked through the hospital like a fortress built on trembling earth, immaculate, composed, and cracking. He didn't intend to see her again that soon, but the universe, or perhaps fate, had other plans. 2 days after his discharge, Grant returned with a small bouquet of blue cornflowers and pale yellow freesia. He told himself it was a thank you gesture. He handed them to the front desk nurse, mumbled something about gratitude, and tried to leave. But as he turned toward the elevator, he saw her, across the lobby, at the nurse's station reviewing a chart, lips slightly parted in thought. Her brows furrowed, a pen resting lightly against her chin. And then he saw him, a man in a slate gray suit, trimmed too, polished, too comfortable in a hospital where he clearly didn't belong. Grant didn't know his name yet, but he knew a predator when he saw one. The man's posture told a story, leaning just a breath too close, one hand resting casually on the counter to block her in. His body not touching hers but controlling her space. The kind of subtle domination that only someone who had practiced it over years could perform in public without drawing attention. Amara's body responded before her face did. Her spine curved ever so slightly inward. Her left hand slid to her stomach, unconscious, protective. Her eyes darted briefly to the left toward the hallway. An exit. And then just for a fraction of a second, her gaze caught Grant's. She didn't register him at first, but then she did. And something in her expression tightly guarded for weeks flickered. Surprise, recognition, and something dangerously close to relief. The suited man turned following her gaze, and his eyes narrowed when he saw Grant standing there. Grant didn't move, didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. Predators didn't like witnesses. The man walked off a minute later, his departure smooth casual. But Grant saw the tension leave Amara's body the moment he was gone. She stepped back from the counter as though gravity had changed, reoriented herself with a soft sigh, and disappeared down the hallway. Grant exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. That evening, Grant sat in his loft apartment, overlooking the edge of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The space was clean, modern, and impersonal, like a man who hadn't unpacked all his emotional boxes. He had designed it himself years ago. It was all clean lines and glass, as if he could protect himself from life by letting in only curated light. He turned on his tablet and opened a search engine. Dr. Amara Fields St. Clair Memorial. No scandals, no lawsuits, a prestigious record. Harvard Med returned to North Carolina 3 years ago. Known for crisis leadership and trauma protocol innovation. Flawless. Too flawless. The kind of flawless that is cultivated, not natural. The kind born from necessity or fear. He leaned back in his chair, the ache in his shoulder pulsing like a reminder. Someone was hurting her, and he was going to find out who. The next day he returned, this time to observe. He stood in the hospital cafe with a coffee he didn't drink near the corner window that overlooked the parking garage entrance. At 7:25 p.m., right on schedule, she emerged, walking briskly, alone. And then he saw him again. The man in the suit, Douglas Rayner. This time Grant heard enough. Hope you've had time to reconsider your attitude, the man was saying. His tone was velvet and venom. I'd hate for things to escalate unnecessarily. Amara didn't reply, but her body tensed small, too still spoke for her. Grant approached with perfect casualness, like he had every right to be there. Excuse me, he said, his voice just loud enough. Think I'm lost again. Visitor elevators. Douglas turned sharply, his face a mask of forced politeness. Recognition flared. This wasn't a man he could intimidate with words. Not here, not now. Mr. Whitmore, he said coolly, a pleasure. Grant offered a polite nod, stepping between him and Amara without needing to. Amara didn't speak, but she looked up at Grant with eyes wide enough to hold the beginning of trust. Douglas left soon after. Grant didn't ask questions, didn't press. He simply turned to her and said, I'll walk you to your car. She didn't argue. They walked in silence through the garage, footsteps echoing on concrete. When they reached her vehicle, she paused. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, he replied. And for a long moment, they just stood there in the dim light, two people who understood more with silence than most could with words. But before she opened her door, she said something that surprised them both. Thank you. And even more softly, please don't disappear. He met her gaze, steady as the mountains. I wasn't planning to. The late January air bit with a gentle sharpness, as if the wind itself were determined to remind the city that winter had not yet released its hold. In a quiet residential corner of West Asheville, where oak trees stood bare and proud along sloping sidewalks, Amara Fields locked the door of her modest brick duplex and drew her scarf tighter around her throat. The neighborhood was quiet, not wealthy, not worn, just lived in. Children's bikes lay toppled in front yards. Someone's wind chimes clinked with uneven grace. Her home stood at the end of a cul-de-sac tucked beneath a giant maple that had once shed red-gold leaves like rain. She had chosen it for the quiet, for the way it didn't ask anything of her. Inside the space was clean, curated, even elegant, but not because she indulged in extravagance. Rather because control had become her way of surviving. Her bookshelf was alphabetized, her couch cushions precisely arranged. Her kitchen, though, seldom used for more than herbal tea or the occasional Sunday omelet, gleamed like a showroom. But beneath all the order, there was something else. Loneliness. Not the loud sobbing kind, but the kind that settles deep in the bones like winter, the kind that makes silence feel heavier than sound. That night she stood at the bathroom mirror brushing out her hair. The reflection that met her eyes was familiar and yet not. Gone were the lashes coated in mascara, the sleek ponytail, the bright lipstick she once used to armor herself during long hospital shifts. She had stopped wearing makeup the week after the attack. It hadn't been a conscious decision, more like a quiet surrender. One less thing to perform. She placed a hand lightly over her belly where a life the size of a peach was growing. 14 weeks and 4 days. "You're real," she whispered, as if saying it aloud could make the truth settle easier. "You're still here." She wasn't ready for the world to know. Not yet. But the mirror couldn't be lied to. Her cheekbones were a little sharper. Her eyes held the weary shimmer of someone who had cried without crying. And somewhere beneath it all, there was a spark. Not hope, not exactly, but defiance. She wasn't gone, not yet. On Friday evening, the sky glowed orange behind the Blue Ridge Mountains as Amara sat in the back booth of a quiet downtown cafe waiting. Grant was late, but not rudely so. She had agreed to coffee. Nothing more. Nothing romantic. Nothing complicated. But her heartbeat hadn't gotten the memo. He arrived at 6:12, dressed in a navy wool coat, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent years being both respected and deeply alone. "Sorry," he said, a bit breathless. The mountain road near Brevard was backed up. Fallen tree. She nodded, hiding the warmth that flared in her chest just from seeing him. "No problem. I ordered you a dark roast, no cream." He raised a brow, amused. "You remembered." "I'm a doctor. Remembering details is my job." He slid into the booth across from her. His presence grounding like gravity had subtly shifted. They talked. Not about the hospital. Not about Douglas. Not even about the strange gravity that had begun pulling them into the same orbit. They talked about nothing, and somehow it meant everything. He told her about the small cabin he was building with his own hands out in Pisgah Forest. No blueprint, just sketches on paper and the quiet therapy of wood. She told him about her mother's old gospel records, the ones she listened to on Sunday mornings, and the lemon-scented candle that always made her think of home. When the waiter brought their second refill, Grant leaned back and studied her. "Can I ask you something?" Amara's fingers curled around her mug. "Depends. Who are you when no one's watching?" The question caught her off guard. Her breath stilled. He didn't fill the silence, just waited, like a man used to listening for the story behind the noise. She looked out the window. The street was awash in the blur of headlights, strangers bundled against the cold lives, brushing against one another without touching. "I used to know," she said quietly, "back when I was still allowed to be. Soft, messy, before medicine, before I learned how to fold myself into something presentable." She turned back to him. Her eyes held no tears, only clarity. "These days, I think I'm a woman learning how to be whole again. Slowly, painfully, maybe for the first time." Grant didn't smile. He didn't offer her a compliment or a hollow reassurance. He simply nodded as though he understood more than he let on. "I hope you let her come back," he said. Who? The soft one. Her lips parted, but no words came. Because beneath all the control, beneath the stoicism and discipline, something inside her flickered at his words. Like an old radio tuning back into frequency. Later, as he walked her to her car, he didn't reach for her hand. He didn't lean in. But when she turned to say goodbye, he stepped just close enough for her to feel the warmth of him. Not demanding, just steady. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking a question I didn't know I needed to answer." He tilted his head. "You wore a mask for so long, Amara, but you're more beautiful without it." She looked at him then, not just with her eyes, but with something deeper. A quiet surrender of suspicion, of isolation. And in that breath, under the dim glow of the street lamp, something between them solidified, not passion, not yet, but promise. Because this was not the story of a damsel and a savior. This was the story of a woman rising, and a man who chose not to save her, but to walk beside her while she saved herself. Saturday afternoon in Asheville unfolded with the mellow cadence of a hymn. Blue skies rimmed with clouds like torn lace sunlight, spilling across historic brick buildings and rustling the bare branches of the town's slumbering oaks. The city, known for its art and kindness, seemed distant from the realities Amara Fields had been carrying alone for far too long. But that was beginning to change. She stood now in the private staff library on the hospital's third floor, a quiet refuge filled with worn leather chairs, donated medical journals, and the lingering scent of old paper. Few ever came here on weekends. That was exactly why she'd chosen it. Across from her sat someone she never expected to confide in, Nurse Elise Darden. Sharp-tongued, fiercely competent, and notoriously allergic to hospital gossip, Elise was the kind of woman people respected but rarely approached with anything personal. She wore her hair in a tight bun, her scrubs always spotless, and her stare could make a grown surgeon rethink his entire career. And yet when Amara had asked her haltingly cautiously for 15 minutes of private conversation, Elise had simply nodded and led her here without a word. Now they sat in the hush of the forgotten room. Elise stirred a cup of lukewarm tea, watching Amara with eyes too perceptive to be fooled. Amara took a breath and spoke the words that had lodged in her chest for weeks. It was Douglas Rayner. Elise didn't flinch. He cornered me in the surgical supply room. It wasn't the first time he made things uncomfortable, but that night he didn't stop at discomfort. And now, she let the words trail off. The weight of them hung between them, heavy and sacred. I'm pregnant. Silence. Then Elise set her cup down with perfect calm. I believe you. The simplicity of that sentence stole Amara's breath more than any apology or comfort ever could have. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she nodded, once her throat too tight to speak. Elise leaned forward. How far along? 15 weeks on Monday. And you're still working. Amara gave a bitter laugh. What else can I do? I can't afford to vanish. I've built everything I have on being strong, competent, invisible in the right ways. Elise's expression softened, not with pity, but something older, something like kinship. When I was a new nurse, I watched the chief of medicine do the same thing to someone I trained with. She didn't report it. She left medicine instead, moved to Oregon. I never saw her again. Amara looked up sharply. Why are you telling me this? Because I've seen this before. I know how it works. They count on our silence, on our shame. Elise reached into her tote bag and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a copy of the hospital's internal grievance protocol, a list of board members, and a contact name circled in red ink. Stella Krause, Elise said. She's on the ethics committee. Fair. Doesn't owe Douglas a thing. If you want to go forward, this is where you begin. Amara stared at the folder like it might explode. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered. I'm terrified. Elise didn't reach out, didn't try to soothe her. She simply sat beside her, strong and still. You don't have to be ready, she said. You just have to be unwilling to stay silent forever. That evening, Amara didn't go straight home. She found herself at the edge of the River Arts District, drawn by the memory of Grant's voice describing the cabin he was building out past Pisgah Forest. She texted, Are you home? Seconds later, yes, you okay? Can I stop by? No need to talk. I just can't be alone tonight. His reply came instantly. Doors open, fire's on, come. 20 minutes later, Amara stepped into his loft and was greeted by the smell of cedar and orange peel. The fireplace cast gold across the floors. The room was warm but not stifling, like being inside a secret. Grant looked up from the couch. He didn't rise or speak. He just offered her space beside him. She took it. They sat in silence for a long time. Her shoulder brushed his. Their knees barely touched. Eventually, she said, I told someone today. He looked at her, eyes steady. About the baby, about him, about everything. She turned to him, her voice low and trembling. And for the first time, someone believed me. Instantly. No questions. Grant didn't speak for several heartbeats. Then gently, you don't have to prove your pain to anyone, Amara. You never did. She looked down at her hands twisting in her lap. It's like I've been living in a house with no windows, pretending the air isn't choking me. He exhaled softly, turning toward her, the firelight catching in his eyes. Then let's knock down the walls. She blinked at him. I mean it, he said. I've built houses from nothing. I can help build you one too. Not a real one unless you want that, but a new place to breathe. A place where the truth lives and shame dies. The emotion in her chest was sudden, fierce, and blinding. Not love, not yet, but belief, and the first fragile root of trust. Outside, the wind gathered in the eaves, but the world remained still. Inside the loft, two people sat close but not touching their hearts, finally tilting towards something braver than survival. Not revenge, not fury, but intent. Unshakable, quiet, patient as stone. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of reckoning, of justice, of a woman reclaiming her life with allies who refused to let her walk alone. The following morning, Amara stood on the cracked concrete steps of a narrow yellow house nestled at the edge of the South French Broad neighborhood. The porch creaked under her weight, not from neglect but from age, like a grandmother, whose bones had weathered every season and still stood tall, offering shelter. She stared at the chipped door frame for a long while before lifting her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles touched wood. "I saw your car." The woman on the other side folded her arms across a cardigan the color of plum wine. "You haven't come by in weeks, and now you show up on a Sunday morning with no warning. You better not be here to tell me you're moving to Chicago again." Amara let out a dry, surprised laugh. "Hi, Mama." Gloria Fields stepped aside without another word, letting her daughter in, with the kind of maternal grace that came from decades of loving hard and forgiving quickly. The house smelled like lavender oil and black coffee. Sunlight poured through lace curtains, catching the edges of the photo frames on the wall family pictures. Graduation's a faded snapshot of Amara, at age 7, grinning in oversized glasses with a stethoscope around her neck, made from yarn. Amara's childhood lived here in every creaking floorboard. She sat at the kitchen table while Gloria poured 2 mugs of coffee and placed them gently on the old floral tablecloth, the same one they used for every birthday and every quiet Sunday since Amara was 10. Silence sat between them like a third guest. "I'm pregnant," Amara said finally, voice low and even. The clink of ceramic halted mid-motion. Gloria set the mug down with a slow exhale. "I figured. You did be to our Simon. I carried you for 9 months, girl. I know when your eyes look like mine used to, like you're holding the world up by your ribs." Amara looked away, swallowing hard. "I didn't plan it," she whispered. "It's complicated." Gloria nodded slowly. There's always a story behind the silence. She reached across the table, laying a hand over Amara's. "You don't have to tell me everything now, not if it hurts, but I need you to know something." Amara looked up. "This child, it isn't shame. It's breath. Yours and theirs. You don't owe anyone an explanation for surviving." Tears brimmed in Amara's eyes. She didn't let them fall. "Not here. Not yet." "Does he know?" Gloria asked gently. The father, Amara, shook her head. "He won't be part of this. Ever. And this man I saw you with last week," Gloria's voice shifted a touch sharper. "The one who walked you to your car like a gentleman from another century." Amara flushed. "His name is Grant. He's not part of this either. Not really. But you trust him." "I do." Gloria nodded once, as if that answer was enough. She lifted her cup and sipped slowly, eyes distant in thought. "He's not the kind of man to let someone he cares about carry something like this alone," she said quietly. "You should know that." Amara didn't answer. She already knew. Later that day, she drove 20 minutes north, winding through the misty roads near Weaverville, until she reached a 2-story brick townhouse at the base of the mountain ridge. She didn't have to knock here either. As she stepped out of her car, the front door swung open. "Thought that was your engine," said Elijah Fields, her older brother, as he leaned against the doorframe, in faded jeans and a paint-streaked hoodie. "What brings the prodigal trauma surgeon to the hills of suburbia?" Amara smirked. "You always this dramatic?" "Only when I haven't seen my baby sister in a month." Inside his living room looked like a mix of a woodworking shop toddler zone and Pinterest explosion. Crayons scattered on the coffee table, a miniature train set half assembled on the rug, and a stack of children's books teetering like a colorful leaning tower of Pisa. "Eliana's down for her nap," Elijah said. "You want tea, or you just here to drop bombs?" Amara raised an eyebrow. "Bombs. You've got that look. The one you wore when you got into Harvard and didn't tell anyone until the acceptance letter arrived." She sighed. "I'm pregnant." Silence. Then Elijah blinked. "Okay, wow. I didn't come here for approval." "Good. Because you're getting protection, not judgment." She smiled faintly, still a firefighter at heart. "Always." He moved to the window, arms crossed. "Is he in the picture?" "No. And before you ask, no, he didn't want this. And no, he's not safe. Elijah's entire posture shifted, his back straight and jaw tightening. Amara, I'm handling it, she said quickly. I've told someone. I'm documenting everything. I'm not staying silent. He turned toward her, expression unreadable. You think I don't know how strong you are? You've always carried the family, the grief, the expectations, hell, even Mom when she broke down after Dad died. But this is different. You're not made of stone. No, she said softly. But I'm not made of glass either. Elijah let out a breath like he'd been holding it since she arrived. Then he crossed the room and pulled her into a hug, tight and grounding. I've got your back, always. And this kid, they're going to grow up knowing that their uncle builds furniture and breaks kneecaps when necessary. She laughed, muffled against his shoulder. It was the first time in months she'd laughed freely. That night as she drove home under a sky littered with stars, Amara felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Not fear, not guilt, but strength. The kind that grows not just from within, but from being seen, held, supported. She had allies now. A mother who didn't ask why, a brother who didn't ask how, and a man who hadn't even touched her hand, but had already helped rebuild parts of her that she thought were lost. In a world that had once tried to break her, she was gathering bricks again. Not to wall herself in, but to build something new, something enduring. On a ridge west of Asheville, where the pine trees leaned against the wind, and the mountains stretched like tired elders watching over the valley, the foundation of a cabin lay waiting wooden beams, kissed by early frost outlines, traced in gravel and hope. Grant Whitmore stood at the edge of the site, a pencil tucked behind one-ear gloves slung through his belt loop, and a blueprint gently rolled open across the hood of his truck. The winter sun had finally decided to make a timid appearance, casting long golden rays across the skeletal beginnings of what would become a sanctuary. Not for sale, not for show. This place, this cabin, was not designed for the world's eyes. It was designed for silence, for clarity, for a life yet to be fully lived. And lately, without realizing it, he had started to imagine another presence here. A quiet laugh echoing through the rafters, a kettle whistling in a kitchen he hadn't yet built, the soft hum of lullabies in a nursery that didn't yet exist on paper. He hadn't told Amara, not because he didn't want her to know, but because the blueprints of the heart were more delicate than wood and stone. She wasn't his to imagine a future with. Not yet. Still, he kept building. That afternoon, as he was fitting cedar planks into what would become the front porch frame, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. He straightened brush of sawdust across his shoulder and turned toward the approaching car. It was her. Amara stepped out slowly, wrapped in a long charcoal coat that caught the mountain light like silk. The wind toyed with her curls as she approached, her gloved hands tucked into her pockets, a curious smile softening her usually guarded face. You said I could visit sometime, she said, voice raised slightly over the rustle of trees. I did, Grant offered a slow smile. Wasn't expecting you today. She looked around at the unfinished cabin posts, standing like ribs beams, forming the skeleton of a home. The scent of cut wood rich and earthy in the cold air. This is beautiful, she murmured. Not because it's finished, but because you can already see what it will become. He didn't respond right away, just watched her. You build the way you speak, she added, with care, precision, but not control. He raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment or a diagnosis? Both, she replied, a hint of laughter in her eyes. He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a thermos, offering it to her. Chamomile with a splash of honey, he said. She blinked, surprised. You remembered. Doctor, he said, mimicking her from their first cafe visit. Remembering details is my job. They sat side by side on the porch frame, boots brushing, sipping warm tea in the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. Only acknowledged. After a long pause, Amara looked out at the valley, her expression distant but not closed. I told my mother and my brother. Grant nodded slowly. How'd it go? Better than I thought, worse than I hoped. She glanced down at her hands. Elijah's ready to go full big brother protective mode. And Mama, she just held my hand and said I didn't know anyone's shame. She's right. I know. But knowing doesn't always make it feel true. Grant reached for a nearby plank and began sanding it slowly, his hands working by instinct. You don't have to fight the lie every day, he said. Some days you just have to outlive it. She watched him work. The way his hands moved measured firm but never rushed. There was something healing in the way he touched the world, not to dominate it, but to bring it into shape. I keep thinking, she said softly, how strange it is that a man I barely knew a month ago knows more of the real me than people I've known for years. Grant didn't look up. Maybe you didn't feel safe enough to be known before. A breeze passed between them, gentle and cool. Amara set her cup down, and now, he paused, looking over at her with a softness that made her chest ache. Now you don't have to be alone with it. A lump rose in her throat, unexpected and unwelcome. I don't want pity, she said quietly. You won't get it from me, he replied, only truth. She looked down at the outline of the porch, then back at him. This cabin, are you building it for yourself? He hesitated. I was. She nodded slowly, letting the answer linger. Then and now. He looked at her for a long time. I don't know yet. Maybe it's for someone who needs it. Maybe it's for someone who's learning to come home to herself again. She didn't speak after that, but her hand bare now found his on the beam between them. Not grasping, just resting, as if she finally believed it wouldn't be pushed away. The sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in swirls of amber and mauve. The scent of cedar mingled with mountain wind and tea and something even quieter, something neither of them dared name. It wasn't love, but it was the outline, the blueprint, a beginning, not just of a home, but of a future made from reclaimed timber, slow healing, and the steady courage of two people who had almost given up on finding softness again. The world didn't pause for justice, not for the wounded, not for the brave, and certainly not for women like Amara Fields, women who had learned how to stitch themselves back together in silence. So when she walked into the hospital's administrative wing on a gray Monday morning, nothing around her felt different. The same antiseptic air, the same fluorescent hum, the same clipboard-clutching interns pretending not to notice her. But something had changed. She was carrying a folder, and inside it lived the beginning of a war she hadn't asked for, but would finish. Elise had called it the paper shield, a meticulously prepared grievance letter, signed and time-stamped, addressed to the hospital board and the ethics committee. Attached was a timeline, 3 witness statements, and copies of her medical evaluations filed after the assault. It wasn't just a file, it was armor, proof, something solid to wrap around a truth too easily dismissed in whispers. She carried it in both hands as if it were breakable, but this truth had already been broken, shattered even. Now it was sharp enough to cut back. At the reception desk, a young assistant with too much eyeliner and not enough sleep looked up from her screen. Can I help you? I have a sealed grievance to submit, Amara said, voice calm and precise. For the board's confidential review, my name is Dr. Amara Fields. The girl blinked, recognition dawning. Not from gossip, but from admiration. Amara was known here for her precision, her empathy, her long hours in trauma. Not for this. The girl took the envelope without comment and set it in the secure tray behind her. It'll be logged this morning, Dr. Fields. Amara nodded. Thank you. As she turned to leave, the girl's voice softened. For what it's worth, I think you're doing something really brave. Amara paused, looked back and smiled. Not brave, she said, just done being silent. She drove back to her apartment through a city that had no idea what had just shifted. The rain came lightly now, not in torrents, but in a quiet drizzle, like the sky was releasing something it had held too long. At home, she changed into a soft sweater and sat on the floor with her laptop propped against the coffee table. Grant had texted to check on her. She hadn't replied. Not because she didn't want to, but because this was hers. She opened a blank document and began writing her own account, not for legal eyes or professional records, but for herself, for the baby. She didn't know if they'd ever read it, but she needed them to know that their mother had not bowed, that even when the world wanted her to carry shame like a second skin, she chose to put it down. I was terrified, she wrote, but I remembered who I was before fear, and I carried her back to the surface one breath at a time. Later that evening, there was a knock at her door. It wasn't Grant, it wasn't Elijah. It was Stella Kraus. The ethics board member Elise had told her about quiet graying with the dignity of someone who had seen power misused more times than she could count and had grown tired of being polite about it. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice gentle. Amara stepped aside, heart thudding. They sat at the kitchen table. No small talk, no posturing. "I've read your report," Stella began, "and I want you to know it's thorough, precise, but more than that, it's human. You didn't write like a woman demanding vengeance. You wrote like a woman demanding air." Amara's throat tightened. "That's all I want." Stella nodded. "There will be resistance. Douglas has friends on the board, people he's helped, people who owe him." "I know. But there are others who are watching," Stella added, "and not all of them are willing to stay silent." A long pause. "Do you want a formal investigation?" Stella asked. "Yes. Even if it means your name becomes a weapon in hospital gossip, even if it affects your future in medicine." Amara met her eyes without flinching. "If I don't do this, I won't have a future I can live with." Stella studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed Amara a small card. "This is the name of a woman at the state medical board. If the hospital drags its feet, she won't. I'll keep you updated." She stood coat in hand. "Thank you," Amara said quietly. "No," Stella replied. "Thank you for remembering that dignity is not something they get to define." That night, Amara sat in bed with one hand resting on her stomach, the other wrapped around a mug of ginger tea. She didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But she felt something else. Stillness. Not the empty kind that follows grief, but the grounded kind that comes after taking the first real step toward healing. She thought of her mother's words, of Elijah's silent support, of Elise's unwavering steel, of Grant sanding wood on a mountain porch waiting for her to say what she needed, and of the baby floating in the soft dark of her womb, heart beating faster than hers, tiny and fierce, and already alive with promise. They would know the truth one day, that their mother didn't just survive betrayal, she transfigured it into courage, that she built her own armor not to wage war, but to walk through fire and come out whole, not unscarred, but untouched by shame. Snow had started to gather on the mountain peaks, a whisper of winter threading through the trees, as if the world itself was pausing to exhale. The cabin was slowly taking shape under Grant's hands, cedar siding now cladding the frame windows installed roof sealed. It stood there in the clearing like a quiet declaration of endurance, not just against storms, but against the fragility of hope. Amara arrived that afternoon without warning. Her curls were tucked beneath a knit hat, her coat unzipped to reveal a gray sweater that hugged the slight curve of her stomach. She stood by the truck for a long moment before Grant noticed her, his gloves half pulled off a level, resting on the plank he'd been adjusting. "You look like you walked straight out of a memory," he said. She smiled, eyes tired but softer than he'd ever seen them. "Can we go for a walk?" she asked. He nodded, unbuckling his tool belt. "Anywhere you want." They walked along the edge of the ridge, the trail muddy beneath melting frost. Pines bowed overhead, and birds darted through the branches like scattered thoughts. "I filed the grievance," she said. Grant slowed his pace, hands in his jacket pockets. "How did it go?" "I won't know for a few weeks," she replied. "But it's done, and that means something." He glanced over, studying her. She seemed taller somehow, as if choosing herself had elongated her spine, restored gravity to her steps. She looked ahead. "I keep wondering if this baby will ever know how hard it was just to make room for them in the world." "They'll know," Grant said quietly. "You'll show them every day." They walked in silence again, the hush between them a kind of music. There were words swelling behind his ribs, words that had been waiting for days, weeks, but he hadn't dared speak them. Not when she was still clawing her way back to light. Now, he wasn't sure anymore. She stopped suddenly at a break in the trees where the trail overlooked the town below, tiny houses like thumbprints against the foothills, the hospital just visible in the distance. "This spot," she whispered, "was where my father brought me once. I was 7. I'd scraped my knee and he carried me here, said this was the place where pain shrank." Grant stood beside her, careful not to intrude on the memory. "I didn't understand what he meant then," she said. "But now I think it's not that the pain goes away. It's just that when you look out and see everything still standing, you remember you're part of something bigger, that maybe the world won't break with you." She turned toward him, then eyes wide with something between wonder and fear. "You've given me more than time and kindness, Grant." He said nothing. She stepped closer. "You've been here, just here, when I couldn't even name what I needed." Her hand brushed against his, tentative, uncertain. "Do you want to know what scares me?" she asked. He nodded, unable to look away. "I'm afraid of needing you." His breath caught. "And I'm even more afraid of you needing me back." They stood in that fragile space, snow falling lightly between them, hearts exposed. Grant reached out slowly, deliberately. His hand found hers, not to possess, but to answer. "I do need you, Amara," he said, voice low, uneven. "Not to fix me, not to save me, just to let me witness you, all of you." She blinked and a single tear traced her cheek. "I've never let anyone stand this close without asking them to leave." "Then don't ask," he said. "Just let me be here." In the quiet that followed, something old unraveled between them, fear perhaps, or shame, or the instinct to flee before the heart could bleed. And something new began. Not a kiss, not yet, but an embrace, gentle, tentative. Amara folded into him as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten, that it was safe here, that she was wanted without condition, that even fire, when approached with reverence, could warm rather than burn. They stayed like that until dusk began to settle, two people wrapped in wool and silence, in the flickering heat of something slowly blooming. That evening, back at the cabin, Grant lit a fire in the hearth. Amara sat on the floor with her legs curled beneath her, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. He brought her tea, placed it beside her without a word, then settled on the floor across from her. "I've been drawing something," he said. She raised an eyebrow. He reached behind him and pulled out a thick sketch pad. The pages were lined with charcoal, rough outlines of rooms, soft shaded corners, windows catching imaginary light. He flipped to a new page. "This one's not for the cabin," he said, setting it between them. It was a small home, simple, with a porch and a garden, a crib in the corner of one room, a stack of books by the fireplace, a table with two mugs. Amara stared at it. "It's a sketch of something I didn't think I'd ever want," he said, "until you walked into a supply room and turned everything I knew upside down." She looked up at him, her eyes trembling. "You barely know me," she said. "I know you're strong," he replied. "I know you laugh with your whole body when you forget to be careful. I know you fold your laundry like it's origami, and I know you breathe deeper when you're in the woods." Her lips parted slightly. "I don't need years to know what it feels like to come home." Amara touched the drawing fingers, brushing the paper. "This isn't a promise," she said. "I'm not ready for promises." "It's not a promise," he said softly. "It's a beginning." She looked at him, then fully vulnerably. And for the first time since everything fell apart, she let herself believe in the possibility of being chosen, not for her pain, not for her strength, but simply for who she was beneath all the armor. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale. But love in the line of fire, yes, but real, steady, and brave enough to stay. The call came just after dawn, brittle as cracked glass and colder than the frost creeping across Amara's bedroom window. She answered out of instinct more than readiness, her voice still coated in sleep. "Hello." "Dr. Fields," came the voice, flat and clinical. "This is Renee Tallon from HR. We've reviewed your grievance. You'll need to attend a preliminary hearing at 2 p.m. today. Conference room D. No further details, no warmth, just a summons." She sat up slowly, her heart echoing with the low, distant thud of dread. It had begun. The machine had stirred. The hospital that day seemed to buzz with an energy she hadn't felt since her intern years, tense, watchful, brittle. Eyes tracked her as she walked through the corridors, not with malice, but with that particular flavor of curiosity reserved for scandal. She wore no makeup, no armor beyond the charcoal blazer she kept for funerals and disciplinary reviews. Her hair was tied back in a tight bun, her jaw set with the quiet precision of someone who refused to fold. When she entered conference room D, the hum of whispered conversation died immediately. 3 board members sat at the long walnut table, 2 men, 1 woman. Behind them, a manila folder sat unopened, its label marked with her name in block letters. And then he was there, Douglas Avery, calm, clean-shaven, draped in a steel gray suit that cost more than her entire student loan payment. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second before slipping past her, as if she were no more than air. The same man who once whispered her name with hunger now denied it like it was poison. He had aged perhaps only slightly, but something deeper had shifted. There was an arrogance in his stillness, the kind that grows when someone believes they are untouchable. He didn't look at her as a threat. He looked at her as a nuisance. That's when she realized fear wasn't something he carried. It was something he built. The questioning began. Neutral tones, measured phrases, an exhausting dance around ethics, policy, intent. Douglas, of course, denied everything. His voice was measured, faintly aggrieved. I was mentoring Dr. Fields. Any private conversations we had were misconstrued. If she felt discomfort, I regret that, but it was never my intention. The board nodded as if this were reasonable. Amara's hands remained folded in her lap. Dr. Fields, one of them said, why come forward now? A fair question, but beneath it she could hear the echo of something else. Why not sooner? Why when it's so inconvenient? Why risk your career now? She lifted her eyes. Because silence doesn't protect anyone but the guilty, and I'm done playing my part in that protection. The woman on the board studied her with a look that was almost something like recognition, but no one said a word. After the hearing, Amara didn't return to her apartment. She drove north up the winding road past the old mills and empty peach stands until she reached the cabin. Grant was there. Of course he was. He opened the door the moment her car stopped, as if he had felt her coming before she arrived. She didn't speak. He didn't ask. Instead, he wrapped her in his arms, and for the first time in days, her body remembered how to release. The tension in her spine unwound. Her breath came ragged and deep, and her fingers clenched the fabric of his flannel shirt as though it were the only thing tethering her to the earth. He led her inside wordlessly and set a kettle on the stove. The fire was already going flames, casting soft gold against the pine floorboards. She sank into the couch, her legs curled beneath her. Only when the warmth of the tea met her hands did she finally speak. They don't believe me. They will, he said quietly. She looked up. How do you know? Because truth has a way of outlasting men like him. Amara stared into the fire. He made me feel small, not because he's right, but because I spent so long shrinking myself to survive him. Grant set down his cup and came to kneel in front of her, his hands resting gently on her knees. You are not small, he said. You are vast, you are a force. And he's a man afraid of women who cannot be controlled. She blinked away tears. I didn't want this to become my story. He touched her hand. It's not your story. It's a chapter. You get to decide how the rest is written. A beat. Will you help me write it? She asked, barely above a whisper. His answer was in his eyes before it reached his lips. Every word. That night she couldn't sleep. She stood by the window of the half-built bedroom, looking out at the woods where the trees stood like quiet witnesses. The moon cast soft shadows across the floorboards. Her hands slipped to her belly fingers, tracing the shape of something becoming real. She didn't know what would happen at the next hearing. Didn't know if her career would survive, if justice would be served, if Douglas would ever feel the weight of what he'd done. But for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of the unknown, because she had faced the architect of fear and had not crumbled. She had spoken in a room where she was not meant to be believed. And still she had spoken. Tomorrow there would be headlines, whispers, maybe retaliation. But tonight she had warmth. Tea, the scent of cedar, the sound of Grant breathing beside her as he slept, one hand resting where her future now stirred. She was not alone, and that was enough to carry her forward. The storm began before the clouds. A low pressure in the air, a heaviness in Amara's chest, a silent thunder humming beneath her skin. It had been a week since the preliminary hearing, since the silence from the hospital had grown deafening, since every morning began with a breath held too long and ended with a sleep too shallow. But today it wasn't dread that woke her before dawn. It was pain, not the emotional kind she'd come to know so well. Real physical pain, sharp and pulsing, radiating across her lower back like a rope pulling too tight. She tried to sit up. A rush of warmth spread across her thighs. She looked down. The sheet was wet. For a moment she sat, frozen eyes wide in the pale blue light filtering through the cabin's window. Then her breath hitched and she whispered into the quiet, "Oh God, it's time." Grant found her in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink hair, damp with sweat, face pale but blazing with determination. "Hey," he said, gently reaching for her. "Hey, what's—" "My water broke," she said through clenched teeth. His expression flickered from confusion to concern, then to action in a blink. "Okay, okay, I'll get the truck. Let's get you to—" "No," she interrupted, gripping his wrist. "We're too far out. The hospital's an hour away, and Grant, the contractions are fast. I don't think we'll make it." He stared at her. "You think you want to have the baby here?" "I think we have to." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The storm outside had finally arrived, winds beginning to howl through the pines, rain tapping urgently against the windows. Then, without another word, Grant snapped into motion. They turned the unfinished nursery into a makeshift delivery room. The old pine bed was softened with quilts. Towels were warmed. A first aid kit was opened, and the emergency OB app on Grant's phone became their unlikely midwife. She labored with strength that scared even herself. The contractions came hard and fast. Pain crashed through her in waves, and between them, she could barely breathe, barely think. But Grant was there, holding her hand, mopping her brow, whispering her name as if it were a prayer and an anchor and a promise all in one. "You're doing this," he said over and over. "You're so close. You're not alone." Between screams, Amara heard herself laugh once. "You are never going to look at a blueprint the same again." And then another wave crashed, and there was no room for laughter. Only survival. Only power. Only the fierce ancient act of bringing life into a world that had tried to break her. At 7:03 a.m., as the first true light of morning broke through the retreating storm clouds, the cry of a newborn filled the cabin. It was wild, beautiful, a sound that shattered the silence in a way no violence ever could. Amara collapsed back into the pillows, sobs escaping her, half agony, half elation. And then there she was, a girl, placed on her chest, slick, in squalling fists, balled, heart beating against Amara's, as if to say, "We made it." Amara wept hard, her arms wrapped around the baby's tiny body, her own body trembling with the aftershock of creation. Grant knelt beside the bed, tears in his eyes, his hand cupping the baby's impossibly small head. "She's perfect," he whispered. Amara nodded, voice shaking. "She's free." Later, wrapped in warmth, the baby nestled in the crook of Amara's arm. Grant sat beside them with a quiet reverence he rarely showed, even in his work. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Amara replied, stroking her daughter's cheek. "She's not his, not in any way that matters. She's mine. Ours. Born of fire, yes, but not claimed by it." He reached over, brushing a curl from Amara's damp forehead. "I've never seen anyone do what you just did." She looked at him, exhausted but unbroken. "I never thought I could." His voice softened. "You didn't just bring her into the world, Amara. You brought yourself back, too." A tear slid down her cheek, but this one didn't burn. It cleansed. For the first time since the betrayal, since the shadows and the hearings and the silence, Amara felt something lift, a chain unfastened. Not because justice had arrived, but because fear no longer sat at her table. This child, this fierce, tiny, impossible being, had broken the last of what bound her to shame. And in its place was something radiant. She looked down at her daughter. "Her name is Amina," she said. Grant's lips parted in surprise, meaning faithful, honest, trustworthy, Amara whispered. "Everything I want her to grow up believing she is, and everything I had to fight to remember in myself." They sat in silence then. No monitors, no sterile lights, no judgment or headlines. Just a man, a woman, and the beginning of a life not defined by the pain that preceded it, but by the courage it took to rise from it. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside a new strength was born, not forged in spite of fire, but shaped by it. It was the way she yawned. That tiny sigh, arms stretching above her head like she was trying to hug the sky. Fingers curled inward just before they fell again to her chest in a flutter. Amina's yawn carried something sacred, something ancient. Amara watched her daughter with the soft vigilance of a new mother, her heart blooming wider with each breath the child took. Amina was barely 3 days old, yet already she held the room in the palm of her tiny, wrinkled hands. Grant sat nearby, working with quiet hands on a cradle he hadn't quite finished before Amina arrived. The wood was white oak, plain, smooth joints, seamless. not a nail in sight. His silence wasn't absence. It was reverence. He carved as if each curve of the wood could somehow mirror the shape of this new life they'd been given. "She sleeps like you," he said, glancing up. Amara turned, messy, fearless. She smiled, brushing a thumb along Amina's velvety cheek. "I want to bottle this moment. I want her to remember it even when she's 30 and the world is less kind." "She'll remember it," Grant said, "because you will make sure the world around her is different." Their eyes met across the room, hers still carrying the shadows of what she'd survived his, holding the quiet oath he never stopped making. But neither said the words just yet. They didn't have to. Not today. On the fourth morning, a letter arrived. It came by certified courier, delivered in a manila envelope, thick with paper and thinly veiled warning. The return address bore the seal of the hospital's legal counsel. Amara opened it slowly. Inside were two documents. The first, a formal notification that the ethics committee had completed its investigation. No formal charges would be brought against Douglas Avery. Insufficient corroboration of misconduct, it read. Advisory notes to be filed privately. No apology. No justice. Just bureaucracy masquerading as closure. The second document, however, was personal. A letter from Douglas himself. It was short, clinical, written with the detachment of a man covering his tracks. "I understand the child has been born. Per prior discussions and to avoid further conflict or speculation, I am requesting confirmation of paternity via DNA testing. Please respond by legal counsel, Dr. D. Avery." Amara stared at the words until they blurred. She had never once spoken Douglas's name in connection to her child. The assumption his entitlement pulsed from the page like poison. Grant walked in just as she folded the letter shut. "Bad news?" he asked softly. She nodded once, setting the envelope aside. "He wants proof." "Of what?" "One in Rachel that Amina is his." Grant went still. Amara crossed her arms over her chest, her voice shaking. "I never asked him for help, never claimed anything. But now that the hospital let him off, he wants what leverage reason to say he deserves a seat at the table." Grant said nothing at first, then quietly, "Do you want the test?" She shook her head. "I want to burn that letter. I want to rewrite every part of myself that ever flinched in his presence." She paused, then added more quietly, "I don't know if he's her biological father, and I don't care." She turned to Grant. "She is not his. She never was. Not in spirit, not in love. Her name isn't tethered to his legacy." Grant walked over and took her hands in his, warm and steady. "Then we don't take the test," he said simply. "But what if?" He silenced her with a gentle shake of his head. "I have held her, fed her. I've memorized her cries and the rhythm of her breath. She already knows my heartbeat. That's what matters, not blood." Amara's eyes filled. "But it'll be harder without legal proof." "I'm not asking for rights," he said, brushing her cheek. "I'm offering presence, permanence. If someday she wants to ask the hard questions, we'll answer them. But for now, the only DNA she needs is the love we put into her every single day." A sob caught in her throat, but it was clean, untainted by shame. "You would do that?" "I already have," he said. "From the first time you let me in." She let herself fall into his arms, trembling and whole all at once. For so long, she'd carried the weight of being enough for this child, enough protector, enough provider, enough strength. But maybe enough wasn't something one person had to hold alone. Maybe enough was a house built by two pairs of hands, steady even through the storm. That evening, Amara took the envelope and placed it in the wood stove. Grant lit the match without a word. Together, they watched the flames consume it. The ink curled, the paper blistered, and with it the last tether between them in a past that had tried to brand Amina with someone else's name. Her name would stand on its own. Their daughter. Not his. Never his. That night, Amara held Amina against her chest, her daughter's breath warm against her collarbone. The snow had returned, falling in soft waves against the windows, and the cabin glowed with firelight. She whispered to the sleeping girl, "You are not defined by the way you came into this world. You are defined by how fiercely you are loved." In the next room, Grant stood at his drafting table, sketching plans for something Amara hadn't yet seen. Not a house, not a cradle, a future. A life where love wasn't transactional or coerced, where family meant choice as much as origin, where a man could choose to father a child not because he had to, but because his heart never gave him the option to do anything less. As the snow thickened, silence blanketed the woods. And within those four walls, wrapped in light love, and the quiet truth of belonging, Amara and Amina, and the man who had rewritten their story with patience and presence, stood untouched by anything that had come before. The sky over Vermont that morning was painted in lavender and rose a soft prelude to the quiet celebration the world didn't know was happening, but didn't need to. Beneath a canopy of birch trees in the field behind their cabin, Grant adjusted the collar of his slate blue suit, his fingers trembling more than they had on any construction site. He had built high-rises, bridges, mountain retreats that could withstand avalanches. But this moment felt more fragile and precious than any steel frame he'd ever touched. Nearby, Amina gurgled happily in her woven cradle placed gently on a patch of quilted grass by Amara's cousin Talia. The baby wore a lace bonnet, her tiny fingers curled around a daisy Grant had tucked into the ribbon earlier that morning. Grant knelt beside her. "You ready to give your mama away?" Amina yawned dramatically and he chuckled under his breath. He looked up at the garden arch, one he'd built himself out of reclaimed timber and wild wisteria vines. Each knot of ribbon, each branch curved with care, bore the markings of intention. Like the vows he was about to speak, a violinist tuned gently in the distance. There were no rows of white chairs, no hotel ballroom, no ornate floral arrangements that required a planner. Just a dozen people who mattered standing barefoot on grass, damp with dew, ready to witness something not grand but true. The wind picked up, and then she stepped into the clearing. Amara. Her dress wasn't white. It was champagne ivory with a whisper of blush, a soft slip of silk that caught the morning sun like moonlight on water. Her curls were gathered in a low crown, fresh jasmine threaded through. In one arm she carried a bouquet of eucalyptus and peonies. On the other, her mother poised and glowing with quiet pride. Grant couldn't move. His breath caught his feet frozen, his hands trembling in earnest now. She walked toward him with the grace of someone who had come home not to a place but to a choice. When she reached him, she didn't wait for the officiant to speak. She simply looked up at him and whispered, "I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who said yes again." Grant's voice shook as he answered, "You didn't say yes to the past. You said yes to now, to us." They turned hands linked facing the woman officiating the ceremony, an old friend of Amara's, a retired midwife, an ordained minister who had once helped deliver Amina's first cry into the world. "Today," she said gently, "is not the beginning of your love. That happened quietly between supply rooms and snowfall, in the spaces where most people forget to look." She smiled. "Today is simply the moment you give that love a name." They exchanged vows without paper, without pretense. Amara went first. "I used to think survival was the end goal," she said, "but you taught me that life begins again when you're safe enough to grow. You didn't save me, Grant. You saw me. All of me. Even the broken parts. Especially the broken parts." Her voice quivered. "And you showed me that broken doesn't mean unworthy. It just means waiting for hands kind enough to hold and strong enough not to let go." Grant's voice followed, soft and sure. "I spent years designing structures meant to last forever, but I never knew what permanence really meant until you walked into my life. You redefined every blueprint I ever trusted. You made space for something messy, beautiful, alive." He looked down at Amina, who had stirred from her cradle and was now cradled in Talia's arms. "You taught me that being a father isn't about biology, it's about presence. And I vow to be present, always, even in silence, even in storms." They placed simple gold bands on each other's fingers, rings Grant had hammered himself, soft edges, imperfect and honest. And then, with tears and laughter circling like wind around them, the officiant lifted her voice. "By the power given to me by the state of Vermont, and by the heart standing witness here today, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Later, they danced beneath the trees. No band, just a playlist echoing from a speaker perched on a log. Etta James, Nina Simone, a little Nora Jones. Amara's head rested on Grant's chest, the rhythm of his heart steadier than any melody. The guests had wandered off, some to picnic blankets, some to chairs by the cabin. Only Talia remained near, bouncing Amina gently on her hip. And then quietly, almost shyly, Amara pulled away just enough to look up at Grant. "I want to change my name," she said. His brows lifted, surprised. Not legally, not for the courthouse, for her. She turned toward Amina, whose eyes were now wide and curious. "I want to be the kind of woman she points to and says, that's what strength looks like. That's what love looks like." Grant stepped closer, brushing her hand. "What name would you choose?" She smiled, eyes shimmering. "Her middle name is Hope. I want to carry it too. Not just in what I've survived, but in who I'm becoming." He nodded slowly, reverently. Then today he whispered, "You are Amara Hope Whitmore." She exhaled, like shedding skin, like letting go. And in that garden beneath branches that had once weathered storms, with Amina giggling between them and sunlight breaking across the clearing, a new family was born. Not built on secrets, not tangled in bloodlines, but rooted in truth, named in love, and destined to bloom. Autumn in Vermont had always carried its own kind of magic. The air turned crisper, the leaves blazed into hues of ember and gold, and the wind seemed to hum lullabies only the mountains could understand. At the edge of a winding ridge stood the Whitmore cabin, framed by trees that bowed with quiet wisdom, witnesses to everything that had changed within its walls. Inside, the morning light spilled across the kitchen where flour dusted the counters, and the smell of cinnamon filled the air. Grant stood barefoot, whisk in hand, while Amina, now toddling, clung to his pant leg, giggling with every lopsided step. She had inherited Amara's laugh, bright, bubbling, fearless, and her eyes a blend of everything and nothing from the past shone with the light of a future not yet written. Amara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a linen robe, curls still damp from the shower. She paused just for a moment to take it all in. The man who once hid behind still in silence, now making pancakes shaped like hearts. The child who arrived in the eye of a storm, now dancing like she'd never known fear. And herself, a woman once swallowed by shame and betrayal, now whole, standing at the threshold of a life entirely her own. "Good morning, Hope," Grant said softly, catching her gaze and smiling. She stepped forward, pressed a kiss to his temple, and replied, "Good morning, love." Later that afternoon, they took a walk through the orchard just beyond the hill, the same place they'd visited once, months ago, when everything still felt uncertain. Amina sat on Grant's shoulders, tugging gently at the collar of his flannel, while Amara strolled beside them, her fingers brushing the low-hanging branches that bore the first apples of the season. They reached the top of the hill and sat beneath an old elm, its roots curling through the soil like veins of time itself. Amara leaned into Grant's side. Amina nestled between them, chewing absent-mindedly on a plush bear that had been hers since her first night home. For a while, no one spoke. The quiet between them had ceased to be absence. Now it was communion. Finally, Amara said, "Do you ever think about how it might have gone if we'd met under different circumstances?" Grant's voice was low, thoughtful. "I do, but I don't dwell on it. Why? Because the road we took, even with the storms, led us here. And here is everything I didn't even know I needed." She closed her eyes, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. "There's still so much I don't know, so much ahead." But when I look at her, she glanced down at Amina, now dozing between them. "I know I made the right choice. Even when it was hard. Even when I was scared." "You didn't just make a choice," he said. "You made a life." That evening, as twilight spread its lavender hush across the sky, Amara sat at the window, writing in the journal she'd started the night she left the hospital for good. The pages were filled now. Grief, love, reckoning, rebirth. She wrote, "Dear Amina, one day you'll ask how you came to be, and I'll tell you that your life began not in a perfect moment, but in a brave one. You were not the product of love, but you were the reason it bloomed. You were the seed of my courage, the mirror of my strength, the light that called your father to me, not the man whose blood runs in your veins, but the one whose soul chose you the moment he heard you cry. You are not bound to the past, you are its transformation. And me, I am no longer just a woman who survived. I am a woman who chose to stay open to joy, to dance in the ruins, to love again, to hope again. She closed the book gently. Grant walked in with 2 mugs of tea and set one beside her. She looked up, her voice soft. Do you think she'll understand it all one day? He reached down, brushing her cheek. She'll live it. That's enough. Outside, the stars appeared one by one like tiny promises pricked into the dark. Inside, a family sat wrapped in warmth. There was no perfect ending, no grand finale, just the quiet, everyday kind of love that heals slowly, faithfully, like roots under frost. And that perhaps is the truest kind of happy ever after. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to stay with us. Like, comment, and follow for more stories of love that begins where pain once lived, of women who rise, of men who choose kindness, and of families born from courage, not convention. Because somewhere someone needs the reminder, love doesn't always arrive on time, but when it does, it rewrites everything.